So I find it a lot easier to talk out my ideas, so I just want to take a second to try doing that with this medium, engaging in a dialogical space with myself. So, spirituality, what is that all about? I've recently been thinking a lot about this problem. I'm writing a book which is very much about what spirituality is and what sorts of relationships are the best kind of relationships to form with the side of human experience which is notably spiritual in character. And what I've sort of distilled at this point, I think, is a little bit controversial in its framing. So I just want to kind of hash this out, see if I can do justice to this idea that I'm thinking of. So I think that first and foremost, spirituality is about conformity. Now, what do I mean by conformity? I certainly don't only mean social conformity, although that definitely plays a part in it. Now, by conformity, I mean something which is more in lines with how ancient philosophers used to think about knowledge. So within, especially Platonists, you have a conformity theory of knowledge. And in order to come to know something, you have to conform your soul to a likeness of that thing. So in order to know what the essence of a square is, or to know what the essence of some kind of animal is, I have to simulate a likeness of that. I have to conform psychologically to the reality of that thing within myself. And this is contextualized by the idea that there are independently existing forms to things. There is, out in the world, some sort of structural, functional organization which exists independently of the thing in itself, and my intellect is directly connected to this domain of forms. And so via the intellect, I can conform to some form in order to have an accurate understanding of what that thing is. So in my work with John Vervaeke, we've been talking about the conformity theory, and he's quite a fan of Platonism in general and also of this conformity theory. And I threw out in our last conversation, I was like, John, I feel you kind of skirt around this, but I think that we should say that the conformity theory of knowledge is a true theory. And he kind of laughed at that and said, well, it's actually a little bit more specific than that. Conformity is perhaps the way that knowledge begins. There is a conformity between an organism and an environment, which is where we first get knowledge. So that looks, for example, like an organism coming into its niche, finding an adaptive space where it can persist in its interaction. We could say that, say, a paramecium has knowledge of a particular kind if it is able to meaningfully interact with its environment in order to sustain its life, right? It's able to conform effectively to its environment. That's perhaps our first standard for knowledge. Now, all organisms do this, right? Human beings are not independent of this. We conform to our reality. We have to grapple with environmental issues. We have to grapple with the availability of resources in that environment. And therefore, being able to conform is a fundamental aspect of the evolutionary relationship. And so what gives us license to say that that is knowledge? Well, you could say that it's an intimate kind of relationship, right? To be able to know another person is to be able to accommodate that person, to conform to their preferences, to take their preferences into account. It's to open yourself up, to change to something in order to fit it into you as you fit into it. So that's what I mean by conformity. So in spirituality, what underlies spirituality? Well, there's this continuum of experiences, which is what John and I are really interested in for this book that we're currently writing. And these experiences are insight, flow, and the mystical experience. So these all are related. They have similar sort of neurological things underlying each of them, just to different degrees of magnitude, say, for example, between the insight experience and the mystical experience. Insight is the aha moment where you suddenly reformulate a problem. The mystical experience of divine union with reality seems to be just that insight, but at a greater degree of magnitude, and perhaps extended duration as well. Although they both are transient in nature, the insight experience is far quicker. You reinstantiate your normal waking consciousness basically within milliseconds of the onset of the insight experience. And they have similar characteristics, right? There's an ineffability about it. You don't really know how an insight happens. It's just poof, all of a sudden, spontaneous reformulation. And there's also a sense of pleasure that comes out of that usually, especially if you have a correct insight. You feel a sort of sense of wonder at that moment, which is a very core feature of the mystical experience. Wonder and awe are the sort of emotional grounds of that experience. And flow also has a bit of this ineffable quality to it, the sacred quality to it. Especially in Taoism, for example, there's a lot of emphasis on flow-oriented practices. Tai Chi is a really good example. So it's basically trying to hack that flow experience to infuse one's experience, one's daily life, in an ongoing basis with this experience of flow. And through flow, with that sacredness that comes along with that psychological ability or activity. Okay, so let's talk about how these things are related to conformity. Now, imagine that you are out in the woods and you are trying to pick berries. I don't know, you're a hunter-gatherer or something. You're out there looking for food, and you're in a happy place. You haven't seen any predators. There's been no footprints, so you seem pretty safe. But you hear this stick break, and then all of a sudden, your whole perception of your reality shifts, right? You have an insight. You go from being in a safe, happy place to all of a sudden being in a different place, a place that is threatening and full of fear. And then, so what happens? So, you hear the stick break, you perhaps notice in the trees some shape which looks like a predator, and then you gotta run away. And so, what is the flow state but something that enables you to perform a physically demanding skill at a very high capacity? So flow is also very much important in adaptively interacting with threat. Insight helps one conform to reality because they can allow you to break down your preconceptions and to see what actually is out there. That's adaptive, especially if there is, for example, a predator in an environment, or perhaps there, let's use a spy scenario. Now you all of a sudden think, oh, hey, it seems like maybe somebody's a spy. I have to reformulate my entire understanding of this relationship that I have because it seems maybe this person has been somebody else this whole time. Flow helps one to conform to their environment because it helps you to very immediately respond to an ever-changing environment. That one seems very clear. Now, the mystical experience. Okay, so there's a lot of emphasis in especially Judeo-Christian traditions, and especially in Islam, on submission to God. God is this all-encompassing, overwhelming thing that we really just have to open ourselves up to give into, to receive. There's a lot of emphasis put in the scientific literature on mystical experiences on the positive qualities involved in them. But one thing that I'm trying to flesh out is the unacknowledged experience of horror that underlies a lot of sacred experiences, right? If you look at the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's a lot of talk about the fear and the wrath of God. And there's this guy, his name is Rudolf Otto. He wrote a great book on sacred experiences. The majority of the factors that Otto writes about underlying spiritual experience are really not enjoyable. For example, there is the experience of the creature feeling. You come to understand that in relation to God, you are nothing. You are dust and ash. There's the experience of overwhelming majesty, that this thing is far greater than you can ever comprehend it as being. There's a feeling of awfulness. And, awful things, when we say, wow, that was awful, we mean that was horrible. But it has the word awe in the root of it, right? There is a fundamental relationship between awe and fear or horror. And the name that Otto gives to the encounter with the sacred is the mysterium tremendum. And from tremendum also comes the word tremor, to tremble. And so it's a kind of fear, a kind of trembling that comes along with it. Now, the mystical experience is notably one wherein this sort of trembling fear and horror is absolved into something. There's a dual character of the mystical state. There is the simultaneous holding of something that could have been horrifying, but that is somehow resolved into this all-encompassing awe. The Judeo-Christian traditions have typically done this by saying that, well, yes, reality is genuinely horrifying and it's liable to fuck you up for absolutely no good reason at all, but the thing that's doing that is actually a loving God that cares for you. And so even if you can't understand how this horrible moment is a part of the all-loving care of God, it's just because of our limited perspective. There actually is something behind that, which is motivated and driven by some goodwill and some love. Now, that has rightfully been called by some a form of wishful thinking. I don't think that's a very accurate way of understanding the problems of cosmology. I think it's a good psychological technology, but it certainly isn't the final answer. So let's look at the relationship here between horror, awe, and conformity. There's a psychologist, his name is Peter Levine. And Peter Levine has developed a form of therapy called somatic experiencing. He's got a great talk on YouTube where he talks about the relationship between trauma and mystical experience. When a predator has captured a prey animal, the prey animal tends to have a number of responses, one of which is to submit, to go limp, which basically allows the predator to kill the thing without it suffering maximally. So there's this adaptive response within prey animals, which promotes the submission and acceptance of becoming prey in that moment, which seems to be something like what is happening in the moment of trauma. A person is confronted with an overwhelming violent horror, and they become immobilized and frozen, and effectively that freezing acts to submit that person's body to that moment. Now, human beings, we don't really have as good ways in place to come back from that. And so people become stuck in trauma, which is where we get post-traumatic stress disorder. The body maintains that submission reaction past the moment where it was perhaps warranted in order to prevent suffering in that moment. Peter Levine cites animals and their shaking behaviors as a way of releasing any of the pent-up energy that comes from this embodied submission. In the past, human beings have had cultural technologies to help us do something like this, right? We've used dance, for example, to enact this energetic shift to get out of that moment of temporary submission and back into a space of agency. But also, psychedelic compounds are very useful for the treatment of trauma. And this is perhaps precisely one of the roles that they have had, is in elevating the nervous system out of this submission, which was automatically instantiated to prevent maximal suffering in a moment where suffering was inescapable. And it does that precisely by initiating a mystical experience, often, not always, but often. And so we can see in that moment where this submission response is sort of absolved by being encompassed within the awe-inspired mystical experience. And it's performing the same sort of technology in the nervous system as the psychological technology of the God concept is performing for Judeo-Christian traditions, where we have a perhaps horrifying encounter with a massive, all-powerful reality that seems to have nothing to do with us. That can be a horrifying moment if there's nothing to absolve it. The emotion of awe is what horror flips into in moments of its resolution. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, that resolution is performed by the concept of God, but there is something that underlies that. There is a more fundamental neurological experience, which psychedelics can initiate. They can take that experience of horror and the effects that persist from an encounter with horror, and they can absolve it into something more growth-promoting. They can transform awfulness into awe. And mystical experiences seem to be a part of a way that human beings conform to reality by having its neurological roots in the horror response, which promotes an embodied submission, which ultimately prevents a certain degree of suffering which could have happened otherwise, embedded in sort of the prey response. And then that seems to be sort of related to a resolution mechanism, perhaps grounded in this moment of insight, where that which seems to be initially horrifying can be reframed as actually full of an all-encompassing love, which includes one within it. The experience of the sacred is fundamental in these particular faculties, which help us to conform to our environment. There's a dark side to the elements of conformity and horror, which are crucial, critical elements within the neurophysiological components of the sacred. Now, when these things are resolved in a healthy way, they can promote pro-social behaviors, they can promote awe, love, a very healthy kind of community bonding. But it's not necessarily going to do that, right? Because fascism is a very clear example of something that co-opted the sacred to bind it to this totalitarian state. I'm just going to go and look up the doctrine of fascism. Yeah, okay, this is great. So, fascism sees not only the individual, but the nation and the country, individuals and generations bound together by a moral law, with common traditions and a mission which, suppressing the instinct of life, closed in a brief circle of pleasure, builds up a higher life founded on duty, a life free from the limitations of time and space, in which the individual, by self-sacrifice, the renunciation of self-interest, by death itself, can achieve that purely spiritual existence in which his value as a man consists. Wow. So what I find really cool about that is that it highlights all of the elements that I was just talking about. So we have a life bound together, a communal conformity. We have the element of self-sacrifice. It makes death something that is not only meaningful, but perhaps necessary. It allows you to submit yourself to the greater whole in order to minimize the suffering of a otherwise potentially horrifying death. It's doing the same sort of thing that the concept of God is doing for the Abrahamic faiths, where it's acknowledging that, yeah, okay, so there is something perhaps horrifying, there's some sort of horrifying thing you have to encounter, here perhaps death, because all of this is being contextualized in war. The doctrine of fascism is really trying to get people to see that war is the way to reassert our community bond in a meaningful way, to participate in something larger than ourselves, namely the state, the fascist state. So yeah, so it has the function of getting someone to sort of accept death, to submit themselves to death, and in so doing, to absolve themselves into some higher meaningful thing. Therefore, life as conceived by the fascist is serious, austere, religious. The conception is therefore a spiritual one, rising from the general reaction of the century against the materialistic positivism of the 19th century. Right? So materialistic positivism says there's really nothing else other than that which we can observe with scientific tools, and the only things that can be observed by scientific tools are material things. And what does that do? But it dislocates the center of man's agency from himself. So man becomes entirely determined by outside things, which is part of what Rudolf Otto says is involved in the experience of the sacred. One comes to see that they have an absolute dependence on something greater than themselves. And in Otto's analysis, that is God, right? We have an absolute dependence on God. That's what the Christian sees when he encounters the numinous sacred. Materialistic positivism, it also says that you entirely depend on something other than yourself, but those things are impersonal, dead mechanical laws. There's no meaning or agency in that system. Everything going on within your experience are the result of neurological events. We can reduce your conscious experience to these neurological events, which are themselves determined by electrical laws, the laws of gravity, biology, all of this. They all come together to determine who you are, what your preferences are, and all of this. So there's this decentering of agency from the individual. And that itself promotes an experience of horror, right? That is the trembling fear aspect of the encounter with the sacred. You see yourself as entirely dependent on something else. But if you see that something else as a loving God, which is a plan for you, then it's possible to still have a sense of agency and to meaningfully engage with the world. But if you take away that psychological conception of God, then what you're left with is just determinism and emptiness. And so the fascist doctrine is a way of replacing what God was doing for us in the past. It allows us to have agency by saying, okay, sure, the individual doesn't have any meaning. At some point, Mussolini says the individual is a non-entity if they don't participate in the state. They don't exist. They don't meaningfully exist. But if we bind ourselves together in the collective will of the state, well, then we can regain our agency that way. Anti-individualistic, the fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only insofar as his interests coincide with those of the state. And the interesting thing, too, is that there is an evolutionary take on this as well. The fascist state is conceived of as being an organism that we all participate in. It's a distributed kind of organism, which is also how religions have typically conceived of themselves. For example, in Christianity, you have the idea of the communion of all saints. Everybody participating in the church is an extension of the body of Christ on earth. We are all subsumed within the identity of that one singular individual, like cells within the organism of Christ. And also in Buddhism as well, you have ideas like that. It's not just any kind of mystical experience that counts, but it's the mystical experiences that help you conform to a reality sustained within a particular kind of community. When we're talking about what spiritual experiences should conform us to, we need to have a good conversation about that, because we can't stop the fact that the essence of spirituality is conformity. We are inherently going to conform to that which is around us by engaging in these experiences. There is a way in which spirituality and encounters of the sacred can pull us into a greater life, genuinely, a life of coherence and order, happiness, altruism, all of this. But it's not necessarily going to do that, right? Because fascism is a very clear example of something that co-opted the sacred to bind it to this totalitarian state. Insofar as we exist within a particular kind of society, with particular kind of social structures in place, the sacred is going to bind us to those. We are a lot more like ants than I think we want to admit. Our identity is both that of an individual and of a collective. And the collectives that we participate in have personalities and characteristics that we will conform to and participate with, and we can change those, of course, and it's probably better that we incorporate the sacred into this exchange between the individual and the collective than that we don't. But I do have a sneaking suspicion that there is a possibility of accelerationism behind our uptaking of the sacred if we don't also really take care in being clear about how we want to take up the sacred and what sort of social structures we want the sacred to conform us to, right? If the sacred is essentially conforming, then we should probably think about that to which it conforms us. What do we want to know? What do we want to be? We have a unique ability here and now to determine those things. We are in a renaissance, really. We are in a time of change. A psychedelic renaissance has been talked about, but I think that psychedelic renaissance was just an initial wave, a very clear example of a broader cultural renaissance that's going on. So I think I'll leave it at that for now. Got a lot of thoughts there, but cool. I hope that was useful. Please leave some comments if you have thoughts about that. I'm really trying to engage a lot of conversations so that I can conform my own knowledge to a broader dialogical space to make it more useful, more relevant, more accurate, etc. So I'd love to hear from you, and thank you for hearing from me.